Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent years, our education system has failed American children. Math and reading test scores have dropped to their lowest levels in decades as measured by data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The drop in math test scores was the sharpest decline seen in the last 50 years. Reading scores declined the most for lowering performing students, but the scores dropped all across all percentiles. None of this should surprise us, though. Liberal elected officials across the country worked with unions to ensure that schools remained closed during the COVID-19 pandemic. American children, especially those from underprivileged communities, were left behind in order to appease the wishes of union activists. In my home state of Florida, we have seen a huge influx into the state of Florida, and I talked to a lot of those families, and those families would come up to me at events and say, the reason that we are here is because we want our children to be in an in-person classroom, and in Michigan or in New York City or all these other places where their children were not allowed to be in person, they moved their entire families to Florida just so their kids could be in an in-person classroom. President Biden and his CDC director worked hand in hand with Randy Weingard, the head of the powerful American Federation of Teachers Union, to keep schools closed for in-person learning in 2021. Thanks to their efforts, American students missed out on vital in-school experiences, and the declining test scores tell us the objective truth about the destructive effects of their policies. Facing such a systematic failure of our educational system, American parents, especially those with the financial means, sought alternative options for their children. Charter schools in New York City saw a 7.8% increase in enrollment between 2020 and 2022. Meanwhile, over 55% of private schools saw increased enrollment between 21 and 22. Congress must work to empower the American families to make the educational choices that make sense for their children. President Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act helped tremendously by expanding the use of 529 accounts for K-12 educational expenses. Looking ahead, we can pass bills like the Educational Choice for Children Act, which would create a federal scholarship tax credit to help encourage investment in scholarship programs to cover expenses related to K-12 education. These policies will help American families achieve the educational freedom they deserve and set up our children for future success. We've seen in Florida, too, my time in the state legislature, where we increased the amount and the ability for the dollars to follow the children in K-12 education. There's a classical academy of Sarasota that's in my district that has a waiting list for children because parents are yearning and striving for a classical education for our children in a place where true education occurs. Mr. DeAngelis, in your testimony, you note that Randy Weingard called President Trump's effort to reopen schools in the fall of 2020 as reckless, callous, and cruel. How did the extended school closures promoted by Mrs. Weingard affect the educational progress of our American students?
Yeah, and Mrs. Weingard pretty much gaslighted the American public before Congress when she tried to lie about their role in keeping schools closed for so long. Twitter, which is now called X, actually slapped a community note on her tweet, which is now a post, for basically lying about how they fought to keep the schools closed. They were saying that they actually fought to keep them open. But this hurt kids in so many ways, academically, physically, mentally, and there are 6 rigorous studies on the topic. I did the first one published in a journal called Social Science Quarterly, all finding that in places that had stronger teachers' unions, the public schools were less likely to remain open. So like there was so much learning loss. There's reports by Emily Oster and her colleagues in National Bureau of Economic Research finding that in places that had schools closed longer, there was more learning loss. And I think this is basically accepted as fact now that the teachers unions had a hand in it, and it led to learning loss for kids. It's time to give families true power, let them direct their kids' education. If we had national school choice all across the country when the pandemic hit, the schools wouldn't have closed as long. And in fact, a study I cited earlier by Michael Hartney and Leslie Finger found that in places that had more competition, more low-cost Catholic schools in the area, the public schools were more likely to open too.
Thank you. Mrs. Varma, am I pronouncing that correctly? As a former state legislator, I was heartened to hear your inspiring story about how the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program helped you and your siblings access the educational opportunities that led to such success. How will legislation like the ECCA help underprivileged youth gain access to essential educational opportunities like you did through Florida's program?
Thank you for the question. This act will help so many families because you're giving the option and the choice to the parents, and parents will know what their what their problems are. They'll know where they stand financially, and they'll know that we need to get this child into a certain school. I know in my story, my parents knew that the only way out of poverty was through a quality education and high quality education until they found the best schools that were aligned with their values, the best schools that were aligned with pushing us academically, and the curriculums. They love to have the direct hand in our education, and my mom knew that. I was talking about this earlier. My mom knew that making sure that she controlled our education, that she knew what was best for us, would help us in our success in the future. So.
Well, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for staying during the recess while we elected a speaker. I know there was a lot of talk about that earlier in the hearing, but thank you for your time. Thank you for being here today. I yield back.